Welcome back. Today we're going to look at some oddities that I found in different newspapers and magazines and books that predate World War I. The main magazine that I focused on looking through was Popular Mechanics, and I cannot say this enough, but the old issues of Popular Mechanics from the 1800s, early 1900s are pure gold mines for finding different interesting and unique articles and topics that can give you ideas to do more research. It's countless. Literally, probably every 5 pages, I was finding something that either references this type of historical research that we do, or was something new to me that I wanted to do more research on. So I'm going to leave a couple of those articles here, just very brief. You can pause the video if you want to read them, but I'm going to focus on the more odd of these findings. And we're just going to take a little deep dive into the past. This will be a sort of freestyle video. There's not going to be a lot of opinion here. I just want to share these with you because they were interesting to me. And these are coming from reliable, reputable resources from back in this day. So let's get right into it. Now I'm just going to discuss some of the more odd and more extravagant articles I found in Popular Mechanics. The first one being about a gentleman, a European scientist, who is said to be able to convert fruit and flowers and even animals that are obviously passed away into metal. Now, it doesn't go into the process here, but it says that this was done with some form of electricity-induced process. So, just something very interesting that was run in Popular Mechanics in 1911. This is the curtain of the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City, and this is made entirely out of glass crystals. This was made by the Tiffany Company, they say, in 1912, and this is the most elaborate glass curtain in the entire world. Very, very beautiful, very remarkable. And you'll find this narrative sort of echoed throughout these magazines with different articles about experiments with electricity. This one is about false or man-made light, or different wavelengths of light that were created using electricity, obviously, and different light bulbs and the such, and its effects on different plants as opposed to natural light. They also discovered, they say, during this experiment, that plants would grow towards the light, which seems like a simple concept, but one that is discussed in detail within these articles. And I find it very interesting that at this time we have numerous and countless experiments with electricity being conducted, while at the same time you have glass crystal palaces of enormous stature that are being built around the world 50, 60, 70 years before this, where they're also doing different quote-unquote experiments with plants. So talk about synchronicity. They're talking about the first films and the first moving pictures being taken, and how this was done was with the invention of a tiny gyroscope. Gyroscopes were being used in our cameras, and this was to make a handheld video camera, and that basically balanced the shutter within the camera and allowed for up to 15 or more photographs to be taken per second. We also have this, which is said to be the type of boring machine that was used to bore the tunnels all around the world in the 1800s and onward. So when we discuss these 2-mile long tunnels, it was machines like that that were being used, they say, as far as the narrative goes, to create these tunnels. What's strange is before the invention of said boring machine, what did we use? Just dynamite? Because we were still creating tunnels like in Pittsburgh and the other railway tunnels that were over 1.5 miles long, and it said we just used hand tools and dynamite to create them. So, very interesting. We also have the development here of, it appears to be rechargeable batteries, which is another technology I'm not very familiar with, so I'm not going to discuss the history as far as I know because I don't know a lot about it. But just interesting that they are discussing rapid recharging batteries. Here is probably one of the most interesting articles that I found in Popular Mechanics because it relates to a lot of the research we've been doing. And it says that while workers in Africa were laying new rail lines, they were being electrocuted when steam engines would run past on parallel lines. And at first, they didn't put two and two together, and they didn't realize why they were being shocked. But eventually, it says they went to run a series of tests, and they come to find out that the steam engine, for some reason, the exhaust from the steam engine was powerful enough to create a sort of electrified field or a force field that was either pulling electricity from the ether or, for some reason, charging up the rails around them that was shocking them. Even though all the rails and the electricity to the rails was entirely turned off, they were still being shocked every time a steam engine would run past them. And I just found that to be interesting. I don't know if that science would hold up today, but this is an article that they ran in Popular Mechanics. Here is a poem that's written from a new, quote-unquote, skyscraper towards the Great Pyramid. And basically, I'm including this because it's the tone of the poem and the overall narrative that they're trying to convey here. It's basically spreading the idea that, yeah, we don't know anything about the pyramid really, but for right now, let's all focus on the new buildings that we're building and not focus on the past we can't explain. And the overall tone here is just really angry. So obviously you can hear in the words of that poem what they were looking to depict and the feeling they were looking to incite. But I just found it funny that that was popularized in a mechanics magazine in the turn of the century, early 1900s. Now this was also published in that magazine. This is said to be the architectural design for the Lincoln Memorial in Indiana, where Lincoln was raised as a child, and this is a glorious, amazing structure, one of the coolest if it would have been built. So I looked into it, and this is what we got instead. We got the Lincoln Childhood Memorial. Now there is some nice carving here, some nice statues, but this is nothing compared to the last image that was published in Popular Mechanics. And in Popular Mechanics it said that was already beginning to be constructed, yet it never happened, and we got the previous photo instead. Pertaining to that, we also have coal mine testing, and they say coal mines were being blown up all around Pennsylvania, and mainly in the Pittsburgh area, but all around Pennsylvania. All these different underground passageways and mine shafts that they created were basically being bombarded with explosives, and they're saying this was done by the government for testing to see how these mines would react. And they're saying these explosions were happening all throughout the late 1800s and continued throughout the early 1900s, and it was nothing more than a few tests. It is interesting to think or consider, did we use up all the material inside of this mine already? Or what would be the reason to destroy something that would bring us profit? That does lead me into the next part of this video that I want to discuss, and that is the possibility of large human-like skeletons being found all around the world, and mainly the largest ones being found in Pennsylvania, Ohio, River Valley, and those areas of America in the 1500s, before we were fully developed as the United States, before even the French had built a lot of their forts. We have discoveries of massive mounds and bones and even underground mausoleums that appear to lend themselves to a narrative that we no longer talk about today because it's all been disproven. But I'm just going to show you a couple articles that were ran in previous years that may lend themselves to you wanting to do a little more research. We'll dive into it now. I'm just going to leave these here. You can stop and pause the video if you'd like to read the articles. There's not going to be a lot of photographs here, but just some different publications all around the world that seem to talk about the same stories and the same discoveries that we say nowadays never happened. So let us now discuss the story of Teutobochus Rex. Now, Teutobochus Rex is said to have been a giant human skeletal remain that was found in a mausoleum-like burial casket roughly 18 feet below the ruins of a massive castle in Dauphine in 1613. Now, as the narrative goes, and you can find this story published in countless books and articles from the early 1800s and onward, and even before that, as early as 1691, you find accounts of this giant being found. Now, the story says there was a group of masons who decided to dig a well at the ruins of the castle of Dauphine, and there, 18 feet below the surface, they hit stone and construction that they knew was not naturally occurring. So they dug out this tomb, and this tomb contained Teutobochus Rex. And I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but you get the idea. And if this was, a fabrication or some sort of discovery that they instantly knew couldn't be real, it wouldn't have traveled the world as it did. This story went around the world like hotcakes, whether it was because of the Masons involved that it was believed, but this was believed thoroughly to be truth even through the 1800s and onward. Only until the early 1900s did you have stories coming out that explained that this was all fake and that the whole tomb and the mausoleum was actually an elaborate hoax that was constructed and inside were mastodon bones. That's what we're told today. But as far as the narrative goes, from the 1600s until the 1900s, we have multiple scientific publications that are reporting this to be true. So these masons dug down below the ground and they found a sort of stone casket, way advanced for its time. And inside they found a man whose stature would be roughly 26 feet tall and 12 feet across at the shoulders, and buried with him was an 8-foot sword. You have to ask yourself, what parts of this story are true? If it was truly a mastodon and it was found, 20 feet below the ground, who buried it there? It still would have been something elaborate that was constructed by a previous society that had to have been in this castle and this area pre the 1600s. You have this massive castle, fortress, and below it, they say, are the bones of giants, not just buried, but buried proper. And it just makes you think. And I just wanted to pose that story with you because you can find the story, if you use Google Books like I do to find old world books that have been uploaded online by the grace of God, you'll find many articles talking about giant skeleton. However, in recent publications, if you look on modern day Google, do a standard search, you won't find a lot about this. So keep your eyes open when doing this research. I'm going to include a few more brief stories about other giants that were found, and you can pause it, look up the names of these giants on Google, look it up on Google Books. You will find a lot of useful and very interesting information. Obviously, none of it can be proven. A lot of it is discredited, at least as far as the current narrative goes. But this is information that is worth researching and can really open your mind. The discovery and inheritance of these different bones seems to lend itself alongside the narrative of a vast previous civilization. I'm showing all of these to basically give you the idea that all around the world, especially in the United States, pre-1900, we have stories every single day coming out of giants being discovered, and then institutions like the Smithsonian coming in and basically taking all the evidence away. Now, the details are all really the same. These skeletons are always found about 20 feet below the surface of the ground. Sometimes they're found lower than that, and the lower you go, the larger the skeletons that are found. So they say some are found at about 60 feet below ground, while those skeletons are up to 40 and 50 feet tall. But you find other ones at about 20 feet below the ground. These skeletons are said to be between 10 and 11 feet tall. Now, these stories seem to be all around the United States. No matter what state you go to, you find evidence of these skeletons, and I think it's very interesting. I recommend, while going through these, if you're really interested and you'd like to read about these, you pause on each one of these just to get a little bit of the details from each story, because you'll find that it's the same narrative being painted in all these small towns all around the country and seemingly all around the world to basically lend themselves to this idea that there were giants walking the earth before us. Now, whether these stories were fabricated for a reason, or we were presented with this narrative for a reason, or if this was just honestly the discoveries that were being found, and these aren't false and these aren't fake as they're labeled today, and these are actually real skeletal remains, then we really must ask ourselves, why exactly is the Smithsonian and other historical societies going so far out of their way to take this information and take it away from you and I? And here is where I want to get into the giant of Thessalonica at Chalet. This is said to be one of the most well-documented cases of a giant as far as proof goes, because you actually have different consorts and consuls of France and the Holy Roman Empire that were sent to confirm and did confirm that this giant was real. Now, they're saying that this giant was literally built into a retaining wall against the sea. And over the years, eventually this retaining wall eroded and bones began to stick out of this retaining wall. Now, they say Once they discovered this, they tore down the retaining wall, and somehow they maintained the structure of the humanoid beneath. So according to the 1691 narrative, this skeletal remain measured in at 96 feet tall, and the scientists, and there were scientists who came to view it, decided that there's no way it could have been a hoax, because they could not fathom or come upon a scientific method in which this complete intact skeletal remain could have been put within this wall and have this long, massive retaining wall built around it. Basically, they decided that the intact skeletal remain was there and the wall itself was raised around the skeleton. That the intact being was somehow encapsulated within this wall. However, today this story is also said just to be an elaborate hoax. And this is the tale that we have with the giants throughout the Middle Ages and the early Victorian times, and throughout the early 1900s. We seem to make these discoveries all around the world. Then you have institutions like the Smithsonian or the church that come in 99.9% of the time, and they take over these discoveries. So it really makes you question, as with a lot of things that pertain to this type of history, where you can lean one way or another. Why were the things like this written about in the 1800s and the 1900s, and even before that, with such glory and a sort of admission of God, but nowadays they're instantly disregarded? No matter where they're found, we have an explanation for them. So, in conclusion, I'm just glad to have shared these with you. These are pretty interesting stories that come from pretty reputable sources. And I hope these ideas and concepts were a little bit of a springboard for you to do your own research, or at least have a little fun watching this video. I thank you for being here. Please leave your thoughts and comments below.